Naomi with Sword and Steel, and today will be lesson number 1. Make certain to comment below if you had any questions throughout the lesson, or if there's a future lesson that you want to have a particular thing answered, you should comment below on it. I hope you enjoy lesson 1 movement for 10th edition Warhammer 40,000. Before we start lesson 1, I want to quickly go over a few things to know about Warhammer for those who have never played the game before. If you want to skip ahead to lesson 1, you can do so as there are timestamps in the video. So, what to know first? Games of Warhammer 40,000 are played 1v1 generally, on a table of at least 22 inches by 30 inches and can get up to 4 foot by 6 foot. To get started, I'd suggest a smaller board size so your games are faster and therefore you can learn the rules faster. That would give an advantage to melee types, but I think simply keeping that in mind and gradually increasing the table size, as the missions suggest, will better show you how far away you want your models to be and which models you want where from your opponent's models. On that table, each person's models will be moving around obstacles, moving over terrain, getting a better vantage point, or trying to reach objectives laid out for you by a mission. At the same time, your models will be attempting to take down your opponent's models and vice versa, either by shooting them down or by defeating them in hand-to-hand combat. How you decide whether you hit, miss, or dodge an attack is determined by rolling 6-sided dice. How far you can move your models, how tough they are, and what weapons they are wielding are found on their data sheets. Here's an example of a Termagant's data sheet, those alien space bugs of the 41st millennia. This part of the datasheet tells you everything you need to know about how they will interact with other models and the battlefield. The Termagants have both ranged weapons and melee weapons. The datasheet tells you the stats of all possible weapons they can field, not just the ones they're carrying. What they are actually wielding is wholly dependent on how you build them. On this part of the datasheet, it will tell you the weapons they are generally carrying. And here it will tell you the weapons you could take instead of one of their more regular weapons. Your assembly guide will direct you to which weapon you build on which model, but for simplicity's sake, if you're trying to decide which weapon to choose, a strength of 6 or lower with a damage of 1 or 2 is generally meant to go against regular troops or infantry, lots of little guys. A strength of 7 or more with a higher damage output, also with generally less attacks, is designed to target meaner opponents. When you're first learning how to play, it's best to start with only a few different models or units, so you can learn the rules of the game without being overwhelmed by the model-specific rules. There are also army-specific rules that will give your models advantage in game, but if you haven't learned to move, shoot, charge, or fight, then now isn't the time to worry about those rules, nor when to use them. Now, one last thing to go over before we start. Game rules. What do you actually need to start playing Warhammer? First things first, you need assembled models. You could wait until they are painted, or you could play them as soon as their feet hit their base. That's up to you, but I'd say start playing as soon as possible. You'll also need 6-sided dice, and I'd suggest somewhere between 10 and 36 of them, leaning towards 36. You'll want tokens to signify the wounds your models and your opponent's models have taken. Make it clear to everyone who is wounded and for how much they are wounded for if they have multiple wounds or multiple hit points. And yes, you could certainly use dice, but make sure the dice aren't the same color as the ones you're rolling, because there will come a time where you'll pick up those wounds and start rolling them. So bear that in mind. You need something to measure with. I like using measuring tape, the 12-inch rulers, and even wee combat gauges, but you'll need at least one of the two former ones to play. And of course, you'll need a source of the game rules and your army rules. If you're one of those who thinks you're going to be able to memorize those rules, then just remember that your opponent will want to look at them too. Particularly if you have a rule that sounds absolutely ridiculous, which definitely exists. And some optional materials you may want as well include terrain. It's not really that optional. The game was meant to be played with fluctuating visibility between your models and your opponent's models. Put something down on that battlefield that you and your opponent can move around, and even terrain your models can stand on. It matters, so eventually get yourself some terrain, unless you want to be wandering around cereal boxes and canned foods, which could also be fun, but something. Most missions have objectives that you'll need to place on your battlefield before your games begin, so you'll need something to represent them. You could make your own fancy ones, buy Games Workshop's fancy ones, or use the cardboard ones regularly found in various Warhammer kits, but you'll need something. You'll also inevitably want some form of battle mat. There are all kinds out there, cardboard, fabric, basic, splendid, but you'll want something to lay out so that you and your opponent know the boundaries of your game. And lastly, you will want a source of missions. Not necessarily right away. Doing a kill or be killed sort of mission the first few times is great for learning your models and weapons and movement speeds and whatnot, but that isn't how Warhammer 40k normally works. The main rulebook has missions you can play. Soon there'll be books coming out with missions you can play if they aren't already out by the time you watch this video. 2-player box sets normally have missions within them as well, so there are plenty of sources to find missions for you to play. But before we worry about all that, it's now time to learn the rules of the game. This is Lesson 1, Movement. First things first, games of Warhammer 40k are played in a series of battle rounds. Each battle round consists of one turn for each player. Generally speaking, there are 2 players facing off against each other in a game. During their turn, a player will go through a series of phases in this order: command phase, movement phase, shooting phase, charge phase, and fight phase. For this lesson, we are going to skip past the command phase because it deals with more complex rules that we can learn after we learn the basics. The movement phase. The measures for movement, shooting range, anything that deals with measurements, are in inches. When you measure how far your model will travel, it is common practice to measure from the beginning of its base, or its hull if it doesn't have a base, and end its move with the entire miniature behind the total distance measured. Some models, generally models of the same type, are grouped together as a unit when they are on the battlefield. When a unit moves, all models within that unit must maintain unit coherency. To maintain unit coherency, it's very straightforward. Models have to be within 2 inches of each other horizontally or 5 inches vertically of at least one other model if that unit is of 2 to 6 models, or at least 2 other models if the unit consists of 7 or more models. At the end of every turn, if a player has models within a unit that are outside of that 2-inch or 5-inch vertical range, then the unit is no longer coherent, and that player has to, one model at a time, remove models from the battlefield until that unit is back in unit coherency. And you don't want to have to do that. You don't want to have to lose models for no good reason besides that they weren't close enough to each other and one got lost. So just make sure that your unit is always coherent. Models removed because of lack of coherency count as having been destroyed. They don't trigger rules that would apply when a model is normally destroyed. The movement phase consists of 2 steps: the move unit step and the reinforcement step. Now, the reinforcement step is only relevant if you have models in reserve that are not out on the battlefield when you begin the game. Since this is not a basic rule, we'll come back to it in a future video and focus solely on just how to move your units. You begin your movement phase by selecting one unit from your army on the battlefield to move. How many models you move, how many units you move in your turn is entirely up to you. With that unit, you can make a normal move, an advance, or you can choose for it to remain stationary, unless it is within engagement range of any enemy models. And by engagement range, I mean melee range. A unit is said to be within engagement range when at least one model of that unit is within 1 inch horizontally or 5 inches vertically of any enemy models. If a unit is within engagement range of any enemy models, they cannot normal move or advance, but they can remain stationary or fall back. Fall back being something you can specifically do when you're in engagement range. So, a normal move, like its name suggests, will be the movement your units perform normally, more than any other. You select one unit to move, and you move all the models in that unit up to their movement characteristic. That would be the M on your unit status sheet, in inches. You don't have to move all of the models, but if at least one model has moved, it counts as if all of them had moved. You can move through friendly units, that means units in your own army, as if they were not there, as long as you don't end your movement on top of them, with the exception of monsters and vehicles. Monsters or vehicles cannot move over other monsters or vehicles, even if they're in your own army. They can move over non-monsters or non-vehicles like infantry, and infantry can move over them, but they have to move around each other, not over, because they're just too darn big. None of your models can move through enemy models, they're just not that nice, nor end your units move within engagement range of any enemy models. If you want to get into melee with enemy models, that'll be later when you're charging. You also cannot end your models move with any part of the base or hull over the edge of the battlefield. even when you're dealing with aircraft, which we'll get to in a future video. If you do put your model over the edge of the battlefield, they go right into reserves. There is an exception to this movement rule: flying. Models that have the ability to fly can move over enemy models as if they were not there. And monsters and vehicles that have the ability to fly can move over monsters and vehicles as if they were not there. Now, like I said, the normal move is the most common move you can make in the game. After moving, you can shoot, or you can charge, or you can shoot and then charge, and then fight. But what if you are too far away to charge in that turn? What if your weapons won't even be in range if you make a normal move? In that case, you might want to instead advance so that you're in a better place next turn. Just like when you make a normal move, when you're advancing, you select one of your units to move, but before you move them, you roll 1d6. That's a 6-sided dice for the brand new players. And add that result to the move characteristic of the unit for this particular move. Then move your models just as you would otherwise do with a normal move, but with the additional movement possibility. If you do advance, you cannot shoot or charge later in that turn. Unless, of course, you have ability that tells you otherwise, like when your unit is wielding assault weapons, for example, which are solely special because you can advance and then shoot with them. You'll find that there are a lot of assault weapons in this game, so you'll see this happen fairly often as you play. Now, as you would expect, remain stationary means that your unit decides not to move this turn. In some cases, this could be because they are holding heavy weapons, which gain a +1 to hit in the following shooting phase if the unit remains stationary that turn. Or because your unit is in the middle of melee combat, engagement range of enemy models, so cannot move beyond falling back, and you don't want to fall back because you are savage and you're fighting to the death. And that brings us to falling back. You can use if your unit is within engagement range of enemy models in an effort to re-maneuver your models. Similar to a normal move, your unit can move up to their move characteristic in inches, and though they can move within engagement range of enemy models during the fall back move, they cannot end within engagement range. If it isn't possible to make sure every single model in the unit is out of engagement range of all enemy models, then you can't fall back. If a model has to move over enemy models during their fallback move, which they can do, they have to take a desperate escape test before you move any of the models in the unit. So make certain you're paying attention to where your models are going to go if they're going to fall back, because you have to take the desperate escape test first. To make a desperate escape test, roll 1d6 for each model that had to take it. 3+ are successes, and that means the model will make their move without trouble. But for every 1 or 2 rolled, a model has to be removed from the unit. Additionally, a unit that has fallen back cannot shoot or declare a charge that turn. And finally, the last thing we'll talk about before I give you your mission is moving over terrain. Models can move over terrain that is 2 inches or less in height as if it wasn't there, and can be moved vertically up or down any terrain features taller than 2 inches if you count the vertical distance as part of its move. But they cannot end their move mid-climb. If it is impossible to end their move on the battlefield or on a flat surface that their entire base can be on, then the move is not possible. And that's all you need to know before you start your mission. And here it is, Mission 1, Capture the Data. Remember, the ultimate goal for this mission is to learn how to move and enjoy yourself as you're going. So change the rules of the mission as you like, as long as you adhere to the rules of the game. You begin with 2 models on one side of the battlefield. They can be the same model type or 2 different model types, whichever you prefer, whatever you're comfortable with. The goal is to get to the other side of the board to reach that computing device where important data is being stored. You want to download the data or destroy the console if you're of that mind and return to where you started. What is important is that on the battlefield, there is some kind of terrain that you have to move over freely and terrain that you have to climb up and down on. You'll also need to remain stationary right in front of the computing device to count as downloading the data. And you can make it a lot more interesting by adding an unbeatable opponent, which will also teach you how to fall back while you're at it. If you don't have a big intimidated model to use for your opponent, use anything. A stuffy bunny rabbit if you need to, just so long as your troops couldn't possibly defeat it. If you want to add this opponent into your mission, the opponent charges your model as soon as it comes within 6 inches of it, and I don't mean charges as per Warhammer charges, I mean it just whooshes into base-to-base contact with your model. So you have to spend that model's action falling back. And once it has charged the model 3 times, that model dies. So your other goal is to have at least one model survive to get back to the beginning placement with the collected data. Now remember, once each model has made one action, you have to restart the turn and over again until either you're destroyed by the unbeatable opponent or you've won. Thanks for watching this video. Make certain to like and subscribe if you haven't already. I will catch you in the next video. Make certain if you had any questions about what you learned today or about the mission or any possible questions that you are still wondering about for the future and you'd like me to go over, comment below. I will catch you in the next one. Bye! Thank you very much to the patrons and YouTube subscribers that have helped keep the channel going and allowed me to save up and buy things like these props in the video. I hope you enjoyed them as much as I enjoyed wearing them. I think this is as tall as the Space Marine would be in actuality. Only come up to his waist. Seems accurate. I'm 5'1", he's 7 foot. See the Terminator? New fella to the addition. He's a bit short for a Terminator, but I still like him. You know what? I might actually be able to fit in this Terminator armor. Oh yeah.